Three, two, one. I think we are live on Facebook.
Hello and welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Facebook Live with the Professor Manan Ahmed Asif. I'm extremely delighted to be in conversation with him. And this is one of the books of 2020 and a very important book. And I hope all of you who are joining in will read and understand what is being said in that. I'd like to introduce Professor Manan Ahmed Asif. He is somebody whom actually I got to know through Twitter. And then this is the first time that we are meeting, even if it's virtually. Professor Manan Ahmed Asif is a historian and associate professor at Columbia University in New York City. He is the founder of the quaint South Asia blog Chapati Mystery and co-founder of Columbia's Group for Experimental Methods in Humanistic Research. Asif's work often combines archaeological, numismatic, epigraphic, and literary evidence and focuses on the history of South Asia. And for those who are on Twitter, his handle is Sipoy. His previous books are A Book of Conquest, The Chachnama, and Muslim Origins in South Asia, and Where the Wild Frontiers Are, Pakistan and the American Imagination. Thank you, Professor Asif, for coming here and agreeing to this conversation. And once again, congratulations on that wonderful book.
Thank you very much, Rana. And thank you to the Caravan Heritage Exploration Initiative and the students and organizers who have invited me to this conversation. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to have this venue. Thank you so much.
This is a wonderful platform, and Ishan and his group have been doing a wonderful job of inviting academics and making whatever they have to say, their thoughts, their books, their discussions, accessible to students. Maybe a year ago, pre-COVID, we would never have thought that we could, have access to professors like you or even Richard Eaton, because Karwan has invited them, Professor Ramla Thapar, all of them have been there. That's a wonderful initiative. To come back to the book, Manan, I got this book on around 7th or 8th of December. And as I was reading it, it was the day of Agha Shahid Ali's birthday. It was his birth anniversary. And I came across a verse, "I'm everything you lost. You won't forgive me. My memory keeps getting in the way of your history." And your book and this verse, they both resonated with me. Mm. And does this connect with you in the same way that it did to me as far as pre-colonial and colonial historians who wrote about Indian history trying to justify British presence in India?
Thank you. I mean, thank you. That's a really beautiful question, I think, and an important question. And Agha Shahid Ali's work is very important to me personally. And also very important politically in the sense that that particular verse is talking about the Indian state and how the history of Kashmir and history of his family, his father in that poem, is recalling memories of their belonging. And one of the ways that I have been trying to think about history for a very long time, I have been struggling as someone who grew up in Ziaul Haq's military dictatorship and who went to school during that time period. And I was told this is what Pakistan's history is, and this is how to think about it, as a history of conquest by Muhammad bin Qasim, as a history of Muslim exceptionalism that only is legible in a very particular time period and under very specific authors and specific ideas. And when I was beginning my work for my first book, which was looking at Sindh and the arrival of Muslims in Sindh, what I kept encountering were actually Sindhis and Balochis who said, our memory does not start with the arrival of Islam, or our memories, our histories do not start with the foundation of Pakistan in 1947. And so you see again and again in my own personal research this conflict between memory and history, between your history, the nation states, to the when one addresses the nation state and says your history, and then one thinks about one's own life and one's parents and grandparents and one's relationship to one's land, dharti, my memory. So I think that wonderful verse from Agha Shahid Ali points us to this tension, if not conflict, that the nation state sets up between memory and history. And that's exactly what I feel that my scholarship is engaged in, is in trying to think about the questions of memory and history. So thank you for that question. Appa, you're muted. Sorry.
I muted while you were speaking. So that's actually a very profound reflection, that memory and history, and something which especially so many of the youngsters who have joined us should think about, that what is memory and what is history, and you'll find that in Manan's book. Then we come to the next question, and that is the name of the book. When you call it Loss of Hindustan, I remember when I first read this name and I had sent a tweet saying ke mera dil kahin na kahin bhari hai ye sun ke lafz ke Loss of Hindustan, and you said bahut umeed se likhi hai maine kitab, aapko pasand aayegi. And truly that book, when you read, then you realize the hope in it, and you do realize that you're trying to demystify all the, what should I say, the baggage that comes with these words. So can you explain a little bit more about the title?
Sure. I think one of the things that when I set out to write this book, one of the things I realized, so I'm an intellectual historian. I'm interested in concepts and ideas and how they move over time. And unlike a social historian or a political historian, I have to kind of think about in the realms of ideas, and how do we kind of how do we kind of have a concept in a mind? And one of the struggles that I think most places and individuals in societies that have been colonized face is that they have their conceptual world are under the colonial episteme, what I call the colonial way of not thinking. And one of the easiest way to imagine that issue is, of course, the erasure of previous concepts, cultures, songs, that pre-colonial would exist, and the post-colonial world, how do we get access to them? So one of the things that I faced was in writing about Hindustan was not that the concept had vanished, but rather the concept had been erased as a true concept. And so hum log, you imagine Hindustan in a very particular way now. You could sometimes think of Hindustan as a style of music, or you think about Hindustan as Satyajit Roy's Shatranj Ke Khiladi, as a decadent moment in time in between UP, Delhi and Bihar, or you think about Hindustan as Savarkar argued for Hindustan, which is Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, as a place where Hindus live in. So you have these in our contemporary world, you have these very, very specific ideas about Hindustan. And one of the things that I, as an intellectual historian, began my book with was, how do I think about a concept outside of these frameworks? And how do I re-enliven that concept? So the Loss of Hindustan is an intellectual history of a concept that I trace from the 10th, 11th century onwards. And the reason it's paired with kind of the invention of India is that there's a naturalness that is imagined for the word India. So we think about ancient India as a completely as a commonsensical appellation. But when we say ancient Pakistan, or when you say ancient Bangladesh, people are like, well, there's no Pakistan in ancient subcontinent. Pakistan is founded in 1947. And the thing is, the Republic of India is also founded in 1947. So there's a way in which our intellectual worlds kind of coincide in how the colonial way of thinking has framed it. Now, what I try to show in my book is that the idea of Hindustan and the making of India or invention of India are in the 17th, 18th, 19th century coterminous. They happen at the same time. And that happening is from kind of thinking about what we understand to be British India. And before British India, there was something called Mohammedan India. And before Mohammedan India was something called Mughal India. And all of these are kind of European imaginations of the subcontinent. And through these processes, the Hindustan kind of begins to diminish, such that by the 19th century, when you have kind of British India, the notion of Hindustan has more or less erased itself. And in my book, my book largely ends in the first decade of the 20th century, where I think most of what the Hindustan that my authors, Firishta, etc., are thinking about has truly come to an end.
I have to unmute, yes. You also talk about the spelling of Hindustan and T-H-A-N, T-A-N and T-H-A-N.
Yeah, that's Savarkar's kind of intervention in the what he says Hindustan being a indigenous word, and he uses the Sanskrit stan rather than the Persian stan, and so that Hindustan becomes his way of thinking about Hindustan as a space for Hindus and a geographical space for Hindus alone, and not in the way that the historian that I look on in my book, which is Muhammad Qasim Firishta, who is writing in the Deccan in the early part of the 17th century, would have understood what Hindustan meant for him.
Which then brings me to the question of how important historiography is, especially when you are writing about a period which is, say, the medieval, the early modern or the medieval period that you have talked about, and you have used Farishta's book. So, and I can see that a lot of young people have joined us here as well as on Facebook, and this is going to be there on YouTube, on the Caravan YouTube channel also later on. So how would you emphasize the study of historiography, and why is it becoming increasingly important to understand how the past was conceived and how the present is sought to be presented?
Thank you. I think that gets at the heart of the book that I've written. In a way, the book is a history of history writing. So as I said, if Hindustan is a concept, then there are many ways of kind of thinking about this concept, right? One could write a history of Hindustan that's focused on food, or is focused on architecture, or is focused on music, as I said earlier, or any other ways that we might our clothing. But as I mentioned, I'm not a social or a cultural historian for that matter. And so for me, as an intellectual historian, what I wanted to signify was how can I trace the idea of Hindustan and its movement over more or less 1,000 years. And again, one can do that in poetry, and one can do that in other genres of literary and visual materials. And what I was interested in and have been interested in for a very long time are historians themselves, right? So people who write history and for whom history has a particular ethics and a particular role. And so what I decided was to kind of very narrow my field and to look at how historians have written about Hindustan. And then what happens to that writing when the colonial historians, or in my book I call them soldier scribes, but the colonial historians, when they take up these histories, what do they make of it? And then finally, in the 20th century, in the 19th and early 20th century, what happens when anti-colonial intellectuals, historians included, have to deal with not only the colonial historians, but also this heritage of history writing that they have all inherited. So in a way, historiography, how does one write history, becomes itself the main focus through which I am trying to approach this question of Hindustan and writing Hindustan. And one of the things that I think historiography becomes, historiography. When I was a graduate student, historiography was a very boring word, right? It's a boring word even if you look at it. Historiography, like what are you? And so it was very difficult to feel excited about historiography, right? You're like, instead of doing history, I'm writing about people writing about history, like how derivative can we be? But what I tried to imagine was that I tried to imagine historians as, in the book, as ethical subjects, as people who take on a responsibility to the future. And this responsibility to the future is, how do I write history such that I make a better future possible, not only for myself and my work, but for the world. And I think that is something that I try to trace over the 1,000 years, and specifically I tried to do it for Firishta, as well as for some of the historians who were writing in the early 20th century, in the late 19th and early 20th century.
I remember when I was doing my master's from Aligarh, historiography used to be a compulsory question. There would be, very similar to, because I had come from an English literature background, there should be a very similar question to reference to context, that there would be a quote and we were supposed to know which book it has been taken from and then discuss the entire thing. And as you said, it wasn't that interesting, but yes, it gave us a solid grounding in the subject. And it was out of 125 marks question, and it had to be attempted. So there was no way that you could leave it and not study it. So we had to study it.
Right.
And I remember Farishta was one of the books that we did read, and you've called it the History of Histories. And you have it's based on historical texts of the past, and as was a crucial tool for the project of writing synthetic, and I'm quoting you, synthetic universal histories that were usable for the colonized subjects. In the anti-colonial struggle of the 20th century, how was the concept of Hindustan reborn and re-articulated, and this history forgotten? That is a very fascinating part of your book.
So I think what I'm trying. Let me just give a little bit of background for our viewers and listeners. I think one of the things that I am trying to do is to think about the shifts in history writing that happened during the kind of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. And one of the shifts that happens, or one of the ways we can understand history writing, is that history writing is either a history of a particular place, a region, mainly a city and its environs, or it's a history of a particular ruling elite, a ruling family, king's father, and so on and so forth. And so you have these two kinds of the tabakat, one can call them, and the tarikh in the other sense. And what happens with Firishta, I try to argue in the book, is that Firishta is the first, he takes on a subject of history writing as itself a thing that requires an ethics and a politics. And he says in that subject of history writing, he says, I'm going to try and write something new, something fresh under this domain of history writing. And what his innovation is, I submit, is that he says he's writing the first comprehensive mustanad, authentic history of Hindustan. So not of a particular set of rulers, not of a particular place that he belongs to, which is the Deccan, Bijapur, but rather of Hindustan as a whole, as a subcontinent as a whole. And here it's from Kabul to the Bengal, from the Himalayas to Lanka. And this geographical space for a history project of history writing happens to be, I think, innovative and important enough that when the colonial state in the middle and late part of 18th century is interacting with both in Bengal and in Mysore, is interacting with history, the question of history writing. We see these colonial officers saying that when we ask for a history of Hindustan, the text that is given to us is Firishta. So within 100, 150 years, this idea of writing a history of Hindustan actually does become a project that goes way beyond the Deccan. And that's how the colonial state enters this picture. So people like Alexander Dow, who say, well, we want to write the history of this colony that we are in the process of colonizing. And for them, this object is very clear. The conquest of the subcontinent is the conquest of the subcontinent's past, right? That's a very, very clear equation for them. We have to conquer the history of the subcontinent in order to conquer the present of the subcontinent. And that's the reason they're seeking out these histories of Hindustan. And then what I call rendering them, translating them, excerpting them, writing about them and on them in English, French, German, etc. And this is all happening in the 1760s, 70s, 80s. So Firishta's project then enters, the idea of writing a history of Hindustan enters the colonial world. But here the colonial world is not, or Europe, Northern Europe, is not interested in doing the type of ethics that Firishta is interested in the 17th century. What people like David Hume and Voltaire and Immanuel Kant, who are all contemporaries and friends, and Alexander Dow are interested in are writing something called the philosophy of history, which is needed for their invention of something that they call universal history or Weltgeschichte. Now, this project of universal history, meaning theorizing history in the abstract across the world, requires, let's just say, raw data. And this accumulation of raw data is where Firishta comes in. So what is the history of Hindustan that we can take our evidence from for how Indians think about history, or what do they think about history writing itself? And I guess the version that we are most familiar with is from Hegel, so a little bit later in the 19th century and early in the 1820s, who kind of writes in his lectures on history, on world history, gives us this kind of topographic map of absence of ideas, right? Africa has no history. China has history 5,000 years ago. India is passive subject of history, is not an active subject of history. It cannot make history. It can only record history. So all of this kind of ideas actually are based on the introduction to this philosophy of history that has happened 20, 30 years ago, so a generation ago. And that's the kind of making of historical knowledge that I want to trace in the book between Firishta's project and the project of the 18th century European conquerors.
That's a very, very important statement that you made just now, the conquest of history. And it's something that we are seeing today also. It's happening all over the world, that we see history is sought to be rewritten. And that is why books like yours become so very important. And to come back to the method that you are talking of, Firishta, and your own book, the other colonial historians, what would you say is, how do you explain historical methodology? And Firishta's as well as a modern historian, because we have, as I said, a young audience, and many of them may go on to become historians and write books, teach perhaps. So what would you like to tell them about historical methodology?
So I think one of the things to understand is the period that I'm interested in one part of the book is the period when European philosophy of history, as I said, is being created. So the discipline of history is coming into being. Discipline of European historiography is coming into being. And, it's not a surprise that this is also when nation states are kind of emerging on the European continent, that are taking themselves as the natural subject of history writing. So the nation state as the natural subject, and then the historian's task to trace mostly the origins of such nations, whether it's linguistic origins, it's racial and ethnic origins, or social and political origins. And this project of history writing in the early part of the 19th century, and then its kind of foundation of the history seminar, in whether it's in Humboldt, or as it moves to the American Academy. All of this is kind of under a rubric of the philosophy of history. So how do we write history? It requires a methodology. And the methodology that we're most familiar with, and even people writing in like people like Scherer and Shibli Nomani who are writing in the late part of the 19th century in Urdu, are familiar with, is what's the Rankian method. And the method here is Wilhelm von Ranke is coming out as a visit to the archives, a bibliography, footnotes, a source critical approach, a claim to objectivity, or to a type of objectivity that can be authenticated by other historians. And then, as I said, the proper subject. So who's the proper subject of history? Is it the history of kings? No, no more the history of kings. It's not the antiquarian, what they call the antiquarian approach. It's actually the history of the state, the history of institutions, the history of national figures, concepts. And so this methodology is what we are, any history department anywhere in the world remains largely beholden to. And there are many critiques that are launched over the last century. Many have criticized it. People have expanded the time frame. There's the Annal school that said, we need to have a very, very wide lens. We need to look at time in a very long durée. There are people like C.L.R. James and others who kind of critique the basic kind of philosophy of histories that are embedded in it. And then people like Hayden White and even Foucault who say we have to kind of emphasize this claim to objectivity and actually say that history is a narrative that is being kind of constructed. So the historical methodology that I think if you are a student in 2020 has to kind of look at this whole approach that, from the Rankian to the Hayden White, critique, and then understand the role of the nation state that continues to dominate the production of history writing. And that's true in India, it's true in Pakistan, it's true in the United States, it's true in China, it's true everywhere. And so the role of the historian has to be to think critically about their ethical relationship to the nation state and to the project of history writing, and to what the history of people who are suppressed and oppressed under the nation state, people who have been written out, whether they're obviously women have been written out of history until the 1970s. One can say Dalit history has still not been a part of history writing projects in a very serious way. And of course, other types of minoritization that happens. So the voice in the history becomes an important aspect for historical methodology of the present. You're muted, sorry.
There are already some questions for you, which I'll ask in a bit. But before that, because this is something that's very popular, at least in India, I'd like you to just give a brief comment on Iliot and Dawson, because a lot of people access the histories of the past from Iliot and Dawson. What would you have to say about the translation?
I think it's the whole book in one way is about Iliot, just because I think he performs an incredible role in creating a canon, in selecting texts that get to be translated or excerpted, and then in putting together this compendium of his. And of course, any critique of Iliot is not new. I mean, during the colonial period, we had historians, including Professor Muhammad Habib, who launched vociferous defense of the types of violence that the colonial project was doing to history writing. So I am in no way the first in any sense, or not even the most comprehensive. I mean, I'm certainly not the comprehensive one who is saying that we should approach Iliot and Dawson as a historical artifact and not as something for ongoing research. And that's basically my one line, that yes, we should study Iliot's work, but study it for 1856, 1857, 1858, 1875, when these works are being published and the world that is visible in the intellectual world of that time. No scholar should be reading those translations and using them in their scholarly work in 2020. No one should be referring to those translations in 2020. I think the project of history writing, especially I say for the writing the history of the medieval period, suffers tremendously by the reliance on colonial translation projects in a uncomplicated way.
And that's again a very important point, because a lot of us who don't understand Persian or maybe Sanskrit read translations. So I hope everybody who's listening here has noted what Professor Asif has said. And towards the end of your book, you just mentioned Professor Muhammad Habib. Of course, I didn't have the honor of knowing him, but I met Mrs. Habib a number of times when I was studying in Aligarh. And you talk of two addresses given by, one is Shafat Ahmad Khan and the other is Professor Muhammad Habib to the IHC. And you say that the one in 1935 by Shafat Ahmad Khan, in his inaugural presidential address at the Indian History Congress at Pune, is very alarmed and spoke about the great moral calamity facing the subcontinent and how quickly the narratives of separation would move from books to the market. And I'm quoting you. And the other in 1947 by Professor Muhammad Habib, that history as a Persian writer, 14th century historian Barani, has rightly remarked, is quickly exported from the academy to the bazaars and the shopkeepers, who cannot distinguish white from black and black from white, and confidently venture to pass judgments on historical matters. Do you see their fears being played out?
I mean, short answer, yes. I think what happened in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s, was that historians, medieval historians specifically, who were engaged in one part in doing history of the pre-modern period, but also who were engaged in kind of thinking about the categories that the colonial state at that time was embedded in. A set of those historians, including the two you mentioned, Shafat Ahmad Khan and Professor Muhammad Habib, were able to say that what we see happening in the field of history writing and in the field adjacent to history writing, which is in colonial policy, is going to end in a disaster. And this is, like I say, it's in the 20s and 30s. It's before what we understand the kind of the last decade pre-partition is really kicks in. And the reason that they're able to say this is because they can see perhaps more clearly the effort by the colonial state to conquer the past and to give a version of the past that is then taken in by those who are at that time colonial subjects. And they try to resist this. They say, look, history. So Shafat Ahmad Khan says there should be a consortium of historians that are writing in easily understandable language and publicizing their work in the public and doing outreach and trying to combat the colonial thinking. And then in 47, the address that Professor Muhammad Habib gives in the December of 1947. So this is after partition has happened and Punjab and Bengal have been partitioned, and there has been a tremendous loss of life. And I think, and that's a, that it's a deeply sad address that he gives, and many others have written about it, including Professor Irfan Habib and Professor Shahid Amin, and other historians have commented on that particular address. So I don't add much new to it, but I do want to say that what I see happening in his address is precisely the bearing out that the cost of historicist claims has come true. So there is a realization in Professor Habib's address that it's the historical claims upon which the logical partition is being enacted that has actually happened. So it's not a civilizational difference, it's not a religious difference, but it's actually historical. It's a difference of historical interpretation. And he, in that address, he points out about the what separates the elite rulers from the people who are the subjects who do not, in his view, who do not prescribe to this type of Hindu-Muslim conflict. I abstract this not to comment on the partition or the coming partition, but to say in the book, what is the ethical duty of the historian? And what are these historians trying to do by saying something is coming, something is happening? I'm writing in 2020. The world that we live in at the moment has obviously many, many challenges, but one of the challenges that I just want to point out is the challenge of the drying up of water and the calamity of a heated world that we face. And one of the things that we see in the upheavals of the forced migrations that we can look forward to in the next 20, 30 years, by 2050, 300 million people in the subcontinent are supposed to have been forcibly migrated from where they are currently living in 2020. 300 million will be dispossessed in one way or the other from their land that they are currently in. If we look at that future, the role that history has to play for it. In other words, the making of victims of this future calamity is going to be done by historical rendering of those individuals and communities. Why do I say that? Because we can look at what happens in 1935 and 1947, and we can look at what happens in 1971, and we can look at what happened in 1992. So we can project forward and say that the way in which we think about history and historical thinking of the communities is going to impact who is targeted and who is victimized and who is dispossessed and who is oppressed in the calamities that come. And I think that ethics of a historian to look ahead and see what use the history could be put to is what I take away and what I try to highlight in the book from these historians who are writing in the 1910s, 20s, 30s.
Again, a very important point, ethical writing of history or being an ethical historian, something which I hope the youngsters listening to us are imbibing. Now there's a question for you from Sarnath Banerjee, who asks, does Professor Ahmed have anything to say about how this colonial episteme, once practiced by scribe soldiers like Alexander Dow, Jones, Hume, etc., continues to exist in history textbooks taught in the British and European education system today? The precious little that is taught, some people seem to think that contemporary nationalistic movements such as Brexit, rise of AFD, Mary Le Pen takes advantage of this bad education. I have a bit of a headache today, so please excuse my not being as fluent in reading.
Thank you to Sarna Banerjee for that question. I think there is a demand that has begun at the very least since 2015, which calls for decolonization in different disciplines and different modes. And it's part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement that says, colonial states, Germany, France, US, have to kind of take ownership of their colonial histories and decolonize the way that they teach history, the way they approach history, from the monuments that they have to the books that they publish and textbooks that they teach in their schools. And so in a sense, this idea of decolonizing history writing or the curriculums is a more or less a global movement at this moment, and has some successes and obviously many failures to its credit. And in a sense, that colonial episteme that I'm tracing back to Dao absolutely exists across the spectrum in various states, including Brexit as mentioned, which is nativist and xenophobic and anti-immigrant, and then dresses that up into kind of economic neoliberalism for whoever wants to buy it. And in the U.S., you see very similar, if not even more profound, usage of these type of narratives. I mean, we're 3 days away from a raid on the Capitol in D.C., founded in much more in the idea that there is a delegitimization of white supremacy in the election, as well as in the general mood of this country, where you see white men and women try to invade and do bodily harm to the U.S. Congress because they feel that their vote, which should count more than anyone else's vote, has not happened in the same way. So I guess the short answer to your question is simply that the process of decolonization is an ongoing process, and I think we all have to kind of take part in it.
I hope you've got your answer, Sarna. There's another question by Arsh Ali. We did discuss this, but what was the role of the British colonial historiography in altering the meaning of the term Hindustan for pursuing their own divide and rule policy in their Raj?
Thank you, Arish. In the book, I kind of lay out how this happens. So this happens in kind of modes, slow modes, where Hindustan first is imagined as Mughal Hindustan. So Hindustan is imagined as the kind of space that belongs to the Mughal dominion. And then from the idea of Mughal dominion, Mughal Hindustan, you go to something like Muhammadan India. And then from Muhammadan India, where this idea of ancient India or Sanskritic India or Hindu India is disambiguated, you enter British India, British India being a political rule of the colonial state. And so you have histories of British India that are being written in the early part of the 19th century. And then the British India as a subject then kind of transitions into what Republic of India and Islamic Republic of Pakistan emerge in the 1947. And so Hindustan is not, you don't go from Hindustan to India and Pakistan. You actually go from Hindustan to a series of other appellations. And what gives birth to Pakistan is something called British India.
Arsh, I hope you've got your answer. When there used to be a UGC scholarship when I was doing my master's, and we used to have an interview for that. And my interview was taken by Professor Irfan Habib and Professor Bipin Chandra. And the question that I was asked was, if there is an ancient India and a medieval India, why is there a British India? I don't remember the answer I gave. I got the scholarship, but I don't remember the answer. But I have always remembered this question while studying history myself, especially these days. So to come to the next question, Najmul Huda Sani is asking, how do you look at Shibli Nomani's contribution to medieval Indian history?
Um, I unfortunately I don't look at it in too much detail. I'm not a historian of the 19th century, and I'm a historian, unfortunately, of the 9th and 13th century. And I thought I was going way out of my league by entering the 17th century. But I have read almost all of Shibli Nomani's historiography. And in another article that I wrote, I called these histories that are written in Urdu in post 1857 by figures, intellectuals like Shibli Nomani, Abdul Halim Sharad, Zakaullah, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, as quarantined histories. And what I mean by that is that even though Muslim intellectuals after 1857 are producing what they see as history by the colonial rules, right? So they're reading European histories, they're responding to European histories, they're doing what all of the kind of mechanical methodological things that European historians are asking them to do, but they're not writing in English. They're writing in Urdu or in Arabic or in Farsi. That historiography, that all that production actually never enters into the way in which we think about colonial and anti-colonial historiography in the present. So someone like Abdul Halim Sharar or Shibli Nomani are basically, they become a Muslim historians who are writing about Islam and basically, you know, almost like muhaddithin or something. They're not historians. They can't write, you know, objective histories. They can write partisan histories. And because those texts are, their work has very rarely ever translated or even studied very critically, you don't see their traces in the footnotes of histories that are written afterwards in English. Besides, you know, obviously scholars at important, very important scholars at Nadwatul Ulama, I'm sorry, in the Shibli Academy, as well as Aligarh, etc., who continue to read these courses. I, as trained in the United States, in the PhD system in the United States, was never asked to read these texts in any of the other spaces. So these are very important historians, and I've tried to make a case for reading them as historians and not as Muslims or as, you know, members of some bygone era.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. There's a question by Sarovar Zedi. Is your work an epistemic decolonization or an anarchist moment of blowing up the archives of both? And where will the debris land?
As a bearded Muslim, I'm not blowing anything up. I'm just saying that for the record. Very peaceful, peace-loving building. So is it decolonization? Yeah, I mean, it's very much in decolonization. I mean, I had hoped, I mean, I don't think this work is where I ended up being, but I'd hoped to write something that I could call the decolonial philosophy of history. Of course, that requires further theorization, and perhaps in my next book I can turn to that. But it's definitely within the argument of how do we think about epistemic colonial episteme from a decolonial perspective, and how do we build new ways of methodologies for thinking forward. And the methodology that is part of this particular book is predicated on I guess the ways in which I'm not separating the medieval and the European period from the contemporary period. So I've tried to write the book in a way that forces the colonial episteme to be in the center of our gaze, which is something that for people who study the pre-colonial period rarely do. So you may read someone who's writing, you know, Mughal history the scholar might gesture to the politics of the present in their acknowledgements, or they might gesture to the politics of the present in their introduction. But the idea is that the history they're writing predates European colonial period, and hence they can kind of write about that period without talking about colonialism. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that the colonial episteme shapes the way in which we think about the past and our access, and shapes the access to the past. That is to say, European museums, European archives, European galleries hold our past. European scholarship, European languages create the discursive space within which we can articulate our past. Our passports control our access to those past. All of these are post-colonial facts, and they must be a part of how we approach the writing of history, no matter what period we're talking about.
There's one question by Sagnik Sarkar. He asked, do you think in the incessant quest to decolonize history and trying to discern British-infused propaganda narratives from actual history, we sometimes run the risk of being overzealous and create a historic bubble just for the sake of reinvention, which may not have actually existed?
Thank you. Yeah, that's an incredibly important question. And it's true for any historical approach, which is the scholar who is writing the history, their footprint, as it were, in the historical past itself. So are we inventing past that we want to see? And in this case, as you're pointing out, if we are trying to correct a idea of the past, colonial idea of the past, are we then creating some other new fantasy, like the colonial fantasies that were created? And I think that's incredibly valuable insight to live with and work with, and to be conscious of it in our own writing and on our own reading. The idea, however, that we can access something pure and clear and clean is an anomaly, is itself a fantasy, and this is a fantasy of social science. We are writing what we think may have been written before, about what we may have been written before. We're interpreting evidence according to our scholarly practices, and other scholars who would read my work, or I would read their work and say, this seems to be true, this seems to be okay. But this is, again, an idea of discursive practices. And someone like Foucault, in his Order of Things, kind of talks about this idea of disciplinary thinking, and how disciplinary thinking evolves to kind of create notions of truthness. And I think as historians, specifically historians of the subcontinent, we just need to be careful and just be very, very engaged in both the meta-historical work as well as the historical work. So there's no easy escape chute. There's no button to push and say, I'm not going to be able to do that. It's to be ethical. And that's why I go back to this idea that is in the history of the work of history writing. There's a ethics to the philosophy of history through which people like Firishta were writing. And if we are writing history, what is the ethics, what is of our philosophy of history through which we approach this notion of history?
That's a very, very important answer also. And this is, Ishan says, the last audience question. Anybody else in this Zoom chat? Because we have some questions from Facebook as well. There's one question on Facebook, Ishan. I'll read it from there, or is it just a comment? Lauren Michael says, unfortunately, the presenter doesn't see the similarities to American deplorables, Indian bucks, and radicalized Muslim. I think we'll let this be over there only. So anybody else has any questions? Otherwise, we'll just thank Professor Ahmed. He says, whoever this person is, says decolonization is being used as a euphemism for political correctness.
I mean, sure, if that's what, I mean, decolonization is not a word. It has it's an entire theory. It's a process. There are at least dozens of books written this year, last year on decolonization. And you can start with historians of Caribbean and of course historians of African slave trade, and of course people who were anti-colonial themselves, Senghor, etc., who wrote about decolonization and what decolonization means. So decolonization is not something that is invented in 2019 or 2020. It's something that we can trace back to Aimé Césaire in the 50s, or W.E.B. Du Bois in his speech to the Conference on Race in 1904. What decolonization is requires a careful study of how it has been deployed and used, and then what anyone like me or anyone else is doing with it in 2020.
Thank you. And thank you very much for taking out time for this conversation. And I hope all the youngsters who joined us, I can see they're not only just students, there are many other people here also, professionals as well as other people who've come to hear you. I hope all of them have benefited from it, and hope all of you buy the book. This is the book. It's there available on online as well as in bookstores. And so I hope you all will go and buy that and read it. And it's, once again, as I said earlier, it's one of the books of 2020 for me. So thank you so much for writing this. And thank you for giving us this time.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you for being such a critical and kind reader, and for your questions that were so illuminating, not only for myself, but I hope for the audience as well. And thank you to all the audience members. I'm sorry I can't see you all, or so I can thank you, but thank you for being here and giving me your time. And thank you to Ihsan and Caravan for hosting this evening.